morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. For our members, we're scheduling a number of exclusive events beginning in July. So we're getting back to in-person as well as these continuing live streams. Plus, for our members, we are offering a subscription to the Daily Chatter for free. This is an international newsletter written by journalists from around the world. So if that's of interest, please check it out on our website. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining our community of thoughtful and civic-minded individuals passionate about discussing domestic and international affairs, politics, and policy. Just check out our website. For those of you who would like to ask our panel questions, there's a panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 minutes. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's program, Looking Beyond a Two-State Solution, Alternatives in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. This is a second part of a two-part conversation that started a few weeks ago, which is in keeping with the Council Town Hall's nonpartisan mission. I'd like to bring on moderator Dan Schnur, politics professor at Berkeley, USC, and Pepperdine. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
We have a great panel that I'll introduce, turn the program over to you. We have Daniel Egel, senior economist at RAND, and Khaled Elgindy, who is the senior fellow, director of program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli affairs. We're really looking forward to this discussion, and we have a terrific audience for you all. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thanks to our audience for being with us today. And I'm especially excited to have the chance to talk directly with Khaled and with Daniel. I've had a chance to read their work in preparation for this program and even prior to this program being scheduled. And I think all of you are going to be very interested in what Daniel and Khaled have to offer in terms of their own observations and insights. You know, it seems like it wasn't too long ago that a two-state solution, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state living side by side reasonably peacefully, seemed like the lowest common denominator of Middle Eastern political discussions. And while there were disagreements about how to achieve that goal, not everyone, it wasn't unanimous, but there seemed to be fairly broad spread agreement that that would be the most desirable goal. And those days seem fairly distant in the past. And now, while that conversation still takes place, it's one of many options being discussed on a radically transformed Middle Eastern geopolitical landscape. And I don't think there's anyone better than Khaled and Daniel to help us understand how that landscape has changed and what that means for the process going forward and what that means for all of us. As Kim mentioned, not too long ago, we had the good fortune to talk with Israeli Consul General Hillel Newman, who offered, in addition to his analysis, his overview of what he felt the landscape looked like in that region. And so, Khaled, I'd like to start with you and to hear your very valuable perspective. How would you describe the current reality as it exists in this region?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Kim and Jessica, for putting this event together and for having us. Real briefly, I would just to sort of paint a picture of the reality on the ground. There are about 13.6 million people who live in the area that we're talking about, in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Different legal statuses in different parts of this land, but for all intents and purposes, there is one state that rules over the entirety of that land, and that is Israel. Now, as it turns out, there is an almost even population of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs who inhabit that land. Again, of various different sort of political and legal statuses. 6.8 million Israeli Jews with full citizenship in Israel live on both sides of the Green Line, that is both in Israel and in the occupied territories. And another 6.8 million Palestinian Arabs live under Israeli rule with varying degrees of rights. There are four main categories of Palestinians. The first being Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. There are about 1.6 million of them. Roughly 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinians who are citizens. But for the most part, they view themselves as second or even third class citizens in a Jewish state, a state that clearly, legally and constitutionally preferences Jews over non-Jews. Then you have about 5.2 million Palestinians who live under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, sometimes collectively called the occupied territories, since 1967. The bulk of them, about 2.7 million in the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority has autonomy in about 19% of the West Bank. Another 400,000 Palestinians live in East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was the part of the West Bank that was annexed by Israel, though not recognized by the international community. And these Palestinians their status is sort of somewhere between West Bank Palestinians and Israeli citizens. They're not citizens, but they have slightly more privileges than West Bank or Gaza Palestinians. Then you have at the very bottom, a little over 2 million Palestinians who are in the Gaza Strip, who more or less been under a blockade, an Israeli-imposed blockade since 2000. So what does it mean to live under Israeli occupation? Legally, occupation is a concept that is governed by international law. It is supposed to be a temporary condition, but of course, Israel's occupation has lasted 54 years. So under international law, the occupying power, which is Israel, has a responsibility to look after the well-being of the occupation that it ostensibly temporarily occupies. Part of that responsibility, part of what international law dictates, is that the occupying power cannot transfer its own population into the occupied territories. But as we all know, Israel has quite an elaborate settlement project throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In practical terms, occupation functions a bit like a military dictatorship. There are very few human, civil, political rights for Palestinians who live under occupation. Rule of law is a very relative term. It is almost by definition, military rule is arbitrary by nature. And in some ways, it's actually worse than a military dictatorship in that the subject population are not citizens of the state that rules over them. So there's no real political or judicial recourse that this population has. Again, it's not just an occupation. It is also a colonial project in which Israel has developed a very elaborate system of laws and policies that serve the settler population of about 700,000 Israelis who live illegally in the occupied territories, and at the same time working to marginalize and dispossess the Palestinian population, as we see in places like Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, where there are large-scale expulsions and demolitions that are planned in order to bring in Israeli settlers. This is why the leading international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch have classified this situation as a system of apartheid.
So in a few minutes, we're going to talk about steps forward, and I think in that conversation, it's going to be really helpful to talk about your perspective vis-a-vis the one that we heard from the Consul General a week or two ago. He brought up matters relating to Israeli security concerns, past not just threats, but episodes of violence. And I think hashing those through to understand the next steps forward is going to be really important for this conversation. But before we get to that, I think it's going to be very helpful for our audience, having heard another perspective, to get a better understanding of the dynamic within the Palestinian population and Palestinian politics. Because one of the things we saw in the recent violence in Gaza in very stark relief is something that experts like you, Khaled, have known for a long time, which is the dynamic between the Palestinian Authority, which oversees the West Bank, and Hamas, which has won elections in Gaza, is a complicated one and creates even greater challenges for steps forward. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that relationship and that dynamic, if you can, before we go on.
Yeah, sure. Actually, Hamas won an election in Gaza, the West Bank, and even East Jerusalem. And the election in 2006 was in all three parts of the occupied territories. Before getting into the specifics of Hamas and its relationship with the PA, I think it's important to maybe broaden the lens a little bit and look at the bigger picture, and to understand the relationship between the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and the Palestinian Authority. I think a lot of folks get the two confused, and often the media and others use them interchangeably. So the PLO was created in 1964 as the umbrella for all Palestinians, both inside the occupied territories and in the diaspora, including the very large number of refugees who live outside of the territory in neighboring countries. It is the legal and political address of the Palestinian national movement. And so the representation at the UN, embassies in various capitals around the world, those belong to the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. The Palestinian Authority is an entity that was created largely as an administrative body as a result of the Oslo Agreement in 1993, and is theoretically subordinate to the PLO. In that it is not representative. It was never intended to be representative, but it was supposed to become the sort of embryo for a future Palestinian state that would encompass the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Both of these institutions, the PA and the PLO, have been dominated by Fatah, the largest and oldest Palestinian political group, for the most part, throughout their existence. Hamas was established in 1988 during the first Palestinian uprising, and it's never really been fully integrated either in the PLO or the Palestinian Authority. Getting back to the issue of the 2006 elections, this is where it gets a little bit blurry. Hamas won an outright majority, so they won the right to form a government in the Palestinian Authority, which came as a surprise to everyone, including the leadership of Hamas. And that created a real conundrum for them, for the international community, because Hamas rejected the Oslo Agreement that created this body in the first place. And of course, Hamas has been committed to violently opposing that process at various points, including attacks on civilians. And so what happened is the international community boycotted the Palestinian Authority as a result, because they could not fund or work with an organization that was designated as a terrorist organization. And that eventually led to the split that happened a year later in 2007, and in which Gaza was violently taken over by Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority remained in control in the West Bank. So that split was the result of that civil war. There have been a number of attempts to reconcile, to bring Hamas and Fatah back together, particularly since 2011. And that would require not just integrating Hamas into the PA, but also reforming the PLO and its institutions more broadly. Those haven't come to fruition. We've had about a dozen or so of these reconciliation agreements. They haven't really been followed through, and so this division has held up. Just to close out this point, one of the outcomes of this division is this intense instability that it has produced, and in that we see these periodic eruptions of violence in Gaza, because Hamas is basically acting as a free agent. It is not bound by any peace process. It is not, up until this moment, really integrated into the PA or the PLO, so it doesn't have necessarily a stake in their success. But the reality is that that division really has worked to Hamas's advantage politically, and much to the disadvantage of the preferred partner that the international community claims to support, and that is the Palestinian Authority. And just to highlight this point, how the collapse of a peace process has eroded the PA and the PLO's legitimacy and boosted Hamas. In the most recent poll taken locally in the occupied territories, when asked if elections were held today, 41% of Palestinians in the occupied territories say they would vote for Hamas, as compared with 30% for Fatah. That is almost exactly the inverse of where it was before the Gaza war. And that shows you, just how much this instability works to the advantage of a group like Hamas.
Okay. And so I want to bring Daniel Egel into this conversation in just a moment, but Khaled, I want to follow up on just one more point. And that's the United States role, both past and present. We'll talk future in a little bit. In the region, in the aftermath of the Israel-Hamas violence, the United States, as well as a number of other countries, have indicated that because of Hamas's designation as a terrorist organization, and because the Hamas Charter calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, they indicated that international aid to rebuild Gaza would only go through the Palestinian Authority rather than Hamas. There's already been serious inflammation on that front in arguments about whether those materials are going to be used for civilian or military purposes. But to broaden the discussion a little bit further, rather than to dig too far deep down into the recent violence, can you talk about the role that the U.S., from your perspective, has played in the past, and whether it's been a useful role or less so?
Sure. So, I think anyone who's read anything I've written knows that I've been quite critical of the U.S. role. I think it's fair to say that the U.S. was never seen as an even-handed broker. I don't think that was ever the expectation. Everyone knows there's a special relationship with Israel. There are domestic political forces that are very strongly in favor of Israel, and they make their presence felt politically. But there was an expectation that the United States, as the sole superpower in the world, and in part because it has such a close relationship with Israel, would be at least an effective broker. That hasn't panned out either. I think unlike a lot of other conflicts, the U.S. has never been an effective mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian context. And that is largely because of the approach that it takes, which it follows almost dogmatically, despite repeated failures. And that approach is premised on two things. The first is reassuring Israel, regardless of what sort of government is in power, whether they're pursuing policies that are compatible with a two-state solution or with peace. And so that is meant at a practical level that the U.S. never puts any pressure on Israel. Again, this is almost dogmatically observed by successive U.S. administration. So no pressure, only positive incentives. There's enormous sensitivity to and deference to internal Israeli politics, fragile coalitions, even before the current one. And the second part of this approach is exactly the opposite with regard to the Palestinians. The focus has been on reforming the Palestinians, on pressuring the Palestinians, on remaking Palestinian politics. And so it is a policy that is mostly sticks and very few carrots with regard to the Palestinians. And so what this means in practice is that the U.S. has basically reversed the normal model of mediation by putting pressure on the weaker party, the Palestinians, and easing up on the stronger party, the Israelis. Again, there's no pressure on the Israelis. The results have been, I think, predictable. by ignoring that vast power asymmetry that exists between the occupying power and the occupied group, and ignoring domestic Palestinian politics, US mediation actually made both of them worse. The power imbalance has deepened as a result of American mediation. That in turn has exacerbated conflict. When you have a greater power disparity, that creates more conflict. And at the same time has weakened Palestinian political leaders and institutions, as we've seen this division over time has in a way been held in place by the international community and by US policy. I could give a number of examples from the Clinton and Bush administration about how these policies have been extremely counterproductive, but I won't. And I will just give an example from the current administration, because even there we see this exact same dynamic playing out again. During the Gaza crisis, we saw this kind of blanket, almost reflexive position taken by the administration that Israel has a right to defend itself, unqualified and without any, like I said, without any qualification. That amounted essentially to a green light for the Israeli army to conduct its military operation as it saw fit. And that was complemented by the fact that the US worked to prevent the Security Council from actually imposing a ceasefire on the parties. Not once, not twice, but 4 different times in the span of 12 days of fighting. That is, again, the exact opposite of the role that a mediator plays. A mediator does not allow conflict to endure until the stronger party has achieved whatever its stated military goals are, but it tries to diffuse and prevent and mitigate against violence. So at the end of the day, the bottom line really is not just that the US failed in its mediation between Israelis and Palestinians, but US mediation actually made an agreement more difficult to achieve and the situation on the ground worse.
Okay, boy, several follow-up questions I'd love to engage in, and hopefully we'll have a chance in a little bit. But Daniel Egel, I owe you an apology because you've been very patient waiting for your chance to engage in this conversation. Before we switch though, Khaled, I want to thank you for your perspective. For those of you who did join in for Hillel Newman's conversation not too long ago, I think hearing both perspectives is very helpful for all of us and gives us some indication of the scope of the challenge moving forward, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. And Khaled, you're exactly right. The Biden administration, did make it very clear that their primary or their purpose was making sure Israel was given the ability to defend itself. And because the White House chose to engage in quieter conversations between Biden and Netanyahu as opposed to more public calling out, we really don't know how much pressure Biden did put on the Israeli leadership or not. So I think your points are well placed, and we can come back to them. But Daniel, what I'd like to do with you is to switch the conversation into the context of public opinion, because for those of our group today who aren't aware, Daniel and his colleagues at RAND have done some fascinating, some really phenomenal public opinion research on public attitudes in the region. And so Daniel, just to get us started, I'm hoping you could give us an overview of your survey findings to help set some context for moving the discussion forward.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks, Dan, and thanks, Kim and Jessica as well. And Khaled, I appreciate the detailed discussion of the Palestinian politics because it motivates the reason for the study we did at RAND. So the background on the study, which we started in 2018, was this sense that there was a political stalemate in the region. People have been pushing for the two-state solution now for almost 30 years, and there's really been no progress. And so what we sought out to do is to provide new perspectives to try to understand, is there is the two-state solution viable? If not, what alternatives are out there that might be viable. And we looked, so we looked at 5 different possible futures. One is what we call the status quo, and I think Khaled, you described this really well. We would describe this, sum it up, it is limited Palestinian autonomy, which I think you described. Number 2, overwhelming Israeli security control, and then expanding Israeli settlements within the West Bank, which is a critical point, which is, I think, something we'll come back to probably as we discuss the future. So that's the status quo. That's one of the 5 alternatives we considered. We also considered a 2-state solution, a confederation, which would be sort of an EU model, where the Palestinian establish a Palestinian state, and they jointly establish a federation with an Israeli state. Annexation, which is one I'll come back to, because this is what we call the Naftali Bennett plan. And as folks know, now he is in leadership on the Israeli side. Annexation, which is annexation of Area C, which is roughly 60% of the territory of the West Bank. That Israel would just take control of it. And then the 5th option is a democratic 1-state solution, which would be much more like a U.S. model. One person, one vote, really equality. So these sort of 5 different alternatives, what we tried to do is we went and we talked with people. We didn't just do a survey. These are complex options. What we did is we sat down with almost 300 Israelis and Palestinians and talked to them for about 4 hours. We laid out the different options. We said, these are the 5 different futures that people have proposed, that politicians have proposed, that academics have proposed. We explained what they were, which was important, because I will say almost nobody knew any of these alternatives, including the 2-state solution. There was a lot of skepticism about the 2-state solution, what it was, just a lack of understanding about these. So we started from that, and then we asked people to rank these. And we asked them to rank it numerically, so we have some polling-like data. And then we asked people to talk about their perspective towards these different futures. And I'll summarize 3 key findings, and then we can circle back on some specifics. The first is that the Israelis did not see that there was a problem, and the Palestinians did not see that there was a solution, which we call sort of no problem or no solution, which I think is really critical. But from the Israeli perspective, the status quo, which has been ongoing, we'll say since 1993, during the Oslo process, it has been defined by, a flourishing economy for the Israelis, and by and large, a very stable security situation. Of course, there are some hiccups along the way, but from their perspective, particularly the last 10 years or so, has been very, very stable. So from their perspective, the status quo right now is great. It's not perfect. They would prefer things might be slightly better, but they didn't see any of the alternatives as feasible. And frankly, the only reason they would even consider any alternatives is just to be done with the problem. They weren't concerned about Palestinian equality. They weren't really concerned about civil rights. Overall, I'm talking in general terms. They just want to be done with the problem. So, not very hopeful there. And from the Palestinian side, they saw no solution. All these alternatives were bad from them. The 2-state solution, which is the international community's preferred option since '93, was described by some as a Zionist plot, which we thought, was sort of shocking. But it's not, even that option is not seen as, realistic or possible. None of the options are seen as feasible. So, really, I think sort of disheartening for us is that right now, independence of major international movements, which we can talk about, whether we're entering that or not, it's unlikely we're going to shift beyond the status quo. The second key finding is that one thing that we thought that the Palestinians focused on in their conversation was their security concerns. Almost everyone we spoke to said they want an army. They want control of their borders. They want control of their securities. And Khaled, you probably know this better than almost anyone else. But Palestinian, their personal security is just not prioritized. We've seen this in the recent violence. Women getting shot at checkpoints. It is, from us in the West, it's deeply problematic. For them, it is as well. And so we think any kind of a future arrangement, any kind of a solution is going to require some sort of Palestinian security guarantees. And then I guess the third finding is that people are trying to find solutions. But the people, again, we spoke with regular people. We didn't talk with the politicians. That's a totally different focus. How Hamas and PA and Israeli politicians will hammer things out. But The people on both the Israeli, the Palestinian side, Gaza, West Bank, across Israel, do not know anything about these options. And so if people want to move forward, if they want a viable and stable solution, there needs to be education. Sorry, that was a quick summary of a 250-page report based on hundreds and hundreds of hours of discussions. Look forward, if you guys are happy to follow up, and please look at our report. It's free on our website.
And Jessica has posted it in the chat box. So anybody who's listening to this conversation who'd like to learn more about it, you ought to be able to link to it. If for whatever reason you have trouble doing it here, we can help you get it directly from the RAND website. Daniel, what strikes me most, and just an array of fascinating findings, is two things. One, the almost diametrically opposed perspectives that Israelis and Palestinians have to offer. And we've seen that over the course of this two-part program also. But second, the sense of hopelessness that you seem to be describing. And so I wonder, given that we've just seen such a significant outbreak of violence between Hamas and Israel, given a new Israeli government coming in, how do you think we should view your findings in the way that we think about the region?
Yeah, I will say it's a question we've been wrestling with as we're trying to figure out, how we should so our study was published in February. And the question, of course, that we're getting is, what does this mean, given, events in the region? I will say I'll raise one issue, which I think we can potentially discuss for the future, which is one of our alternatives, which was the second highest ranked for Israelis. We did our ranking. So the first was the status quo, the way things are for the Israelis. The second highest ranked was annexation. And this was what we call the Naftali Bennett plan. It's a plan he proposed in 2012. And when the Knesset over the weekend, he gave a speech where he, depending on who you talk to, he says, this is his quote, ensure the national interest in Area C, basically doubling down on his proposal to annex Area C. And I think this is, annexation of Area C is an interesting alternative to consider. His plan, so what he proposed to do was to take, this is 60% of the territory of the West Bank, and he would give Israeli citizenship or residency to all the Palestinians living in those areas. So it would expand the area of Israel. It's very controversial, and Khaled can probably talk a little bit more about the political ramifications. But I will say that that's probably been the most interesting development. The other thing I will say is that the violence was severe. It was horrific. Hundreds were killed during the 11 days of violence that we saw during May. But afterwards, everything's basically back to normal, as far as I can tell. And I think that's one thing that was really surprising to me. At the time, we saw something that was almost unprecedented, is that we saw significant instability within Israel for a very short time. There was mob violence. There was, Israeli Arabs pulling, Jewish people out of cars and beating them up, et cetera, on both sides. That was really unprecedented. And for a moment, people thought that this may be, a major change, a major inflection point politically. I will say, it seems to me that we're sort of back to normal. The Israeli Arabs have now joined a coalition government, and which is remarkable. What that will mean for the politics of Israel, I think, is anybody's guess. Certainly, it will take people that understand the dynamics on the ground better than I. But people said that this violence, was significant. It was, but I don't think it's going to change anything basically on the ground.
Okay. And the Bennett plan itself, I think, is particularly interesting. And one of the things, so hopefully we can get into either in our next part of our discussion or questions with the audience, is whether Naftali Bennett's going to be able to move forward, given likely opposition from the Biden administration and perhaps from his own coalition. But that leads into, that's one specific question. What I'd like to do for a few minutes before we bring Jessica and the audience in, is I'd like to talk more broadly about what comes next. And Khaled, like Daniel a few minutes ago, you've been very patient. And so I'd like to come back to you first, and then Daniel, give you a chance to weigh in on the same question. Given what we've discussed over the first 30 minutes or so, what do you think given the landscape we've all discussed, what do you think would be the most important and the most advisable next steps to take going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the focus would be on stabilizing the situation. I'm a little bit less sanguine about the status quo than Daniel. I don't think things have gone back to normal. I think for Israelis, things are more or less normal because normal means normal in Israel. Israelis go back to work, they go to the beach. They're, for the most part, post-COVID. And so life is normal. For Palestinians, life is not normal. And so back to the status quo is back to a blockade in Gaza that has really devastated any sense of an economy there. Something like 70% of Gaza's population are dependent on food aid from the international community. Imports and exports are virtually banned for the past 15 years. So, the situation is quite terrible. And this is a classic case. I mean, this is standard asymmetrical warfare. The status quo is very comfortable for Israelis. It is extremely uncomfortable for Palestinians. The only way for Palestinians to impress that upon Israelis is very often through violence. And that is the nature of asymmetric warfare. Even the calculation is such that even when the cost is greater on the weaker side, as we saw the Israeli bombardment for 12 days, killed hundreds of Palestinians, including something like 67 children, destroyed entire apartment buildings. And yet the public, even in Gaza, a majority are supportive of Hamas rockets on Israel, because it is the only way to challenge the status quo. Since there is no diplomatic process, there isn't even a movement towards a diplomatic process, this becomes Palestinians' only way to challenge the status quo. So the goal now should be to stabilize the situation by changing these conditions that lead to these periodic eruptions of violence, whether they're in Gaza or in places like Jerusalem. So putting a stop on these expulsions, which could happen any day, any week now in places like Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, and also upcoming in another neighborhood in Jerusalem, in Silwan, where there are several dozen other homes that are slated for demolition and expulsion, again, so they can bring in settlers. So those need to be put on hold. A settlement freeze in the West Bank has been the basic demand of the international community for decades. We have never had a freeze on Israeli settlement activity. And now US administrations don't even bother talking about it. They used to talk about constraining, restraining, a timeout on settlements. Now they don't even bother because they simply don't want to deal with the pushback from the Israelis or pro-Israel folks in Congress. Reopening Palestinian institutions that have been systematically shut down over the past 2 decades. Palestinians in Jerusalem are political orphans. Israel has almost obsessively gone after any sort of Palestinian institution, any hint of any institution that identifies as Palestinian, even non-political institutions, cultural institutions. You see the videos in Jerusalem of soldiers freaking out over a single Palestinian flag. I mean, there is a real obsession with de-Palestinianizing Jerusalem. That's one thing. The most important thing that can happen, though, is the situation in Gaza. There has to be a way out of this quote-unquote normal, where we have periodic eruptions, these horrific wars every so often. That needs to be prevented mainly by lifting the blockade. The only way to lift the blockade is to bring the Palestinian Authority back to the Gaza Strip. The only way to bring the Palestinian Authority to Gaza is to have a reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah to integrate Hamas into Palestinian politics. That there is the key that Israel and the United States and the international community have been wanting to avoid, and why we are stuck in this, horrific kind of Groundhog's Day situation where we have these recurring wars in Gaza, because we are not prepared to deal with the reality that Hamas is in fact a political reality. We can't wish it out of existence. We can't blockade it out of existence. You can't bomb it out of existence. We know that because we have the empirical evidence of 4 or 5 different wars in Gaza show that. Hamas has only grown stronger. So we need to find a way to integrate Hamas into the political process, starting with Palestinian politics. Otherwise, this nightmare is just going to keep on happening over and over again.
Well, if I hear a sliver of hope in that overview, Khaled, it's about the potential role of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. And while it's moving slowly, I'll be hopeful that the fact that not just the U.S. but Egypt and other relevant outside powers are working hard to make sure that the Palestinian Authority plays an integral role in the rebuilding of Gaza. But Daniel, once again, I'll go back to your findings about the dramatically different perspectives the Israeli and Palestinians see. For those of you who tuned into the first part of this 2-part series, we heard Hillel Newman talk about the blockade in a much different way than Khaled did, where he pointed out that Israel and Egypt are wary of shipments, not just of civilian supplies, but military supplies. And that's a conversation we'll have to have when we have more time. But given these very vast differences in perspective, Daniel, what do you see? What can you take from your findings as the most important steps for us to consider going forward?
Well, just 2 comments, to Khaled's comment about, his, whether the status quo is viable or not. I will say that, the status quo has been viable because of the Israelis, not because of the Palestinians. There's important security cooperation between the PA and the Israelis, which we could, have another hour someday to talk about. But if the Israelis want to continue with the status quo, history has not suggested that they cannot. From their perspective, and you certainly see this in the discourse recently, Hamas in the Gaza Strip is a manageable problem. There was a loss of life on the Israeli side, certainly in the 11 days of violence. And I'm certain people do not want to repeat it, but that was a successful operation from their perspective. It was precise, and it achieved the objectives they wanted to very quickly. And I think from their perspective, they see that they can maintain this. And frankly, I think politically, this new government's not going to shift off of this posture. So, are we going to see any major changes? Probably not. In terms of what can be done going forward, which I think was, the overarching question that we started with at the beginning, from the U.S. side, the U.S. government has a new tool, which I think is actually really important, which is the MEPI, which is the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, it was a 10-year process to get this thing in place, but Congress appropriated $250 million over the next 5 years to try to build, from the bottom up, partnerships and cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians. I think this is really, really important. My first interaction with this conflict was back in the early 2000s. And this was back when every Israeli had Palestinian friends. Every Israeli drove to the West Bank to get their car fixed. There was partnerships, there was cooperation. After the second Intifada, relationships broke down. And I will say, one of the things we found in our work is that trust between Israelis and Palestinians is probably at its nadir. It's never been this bad. Even if you could get people to sit down and talk, I don't think that they would trust each other. And so I am hopeful that this new tool in the U.S. quiver, in addition to the pushing for the 2-state solution, but being able to build, partnerships from the bottom up, people-to-people interactions, just getting, Israelis and Palestinians to talk to each other. How you get Hamas into that conversation. I will leave that. Khaled probably has proposals for how you can do that, but it's absolutely critical. That may offer Biden a new tool in moving things forward, but we will see.
Okay. Well, guys, we've taken more time for what we can still refer to charitably as introductory conversation than I think we planned for. But we do want to bring in our audience, and with the remaining time, perhaps we can go a little bit past the 11:30 original stop time, Jessica, in order to get in a few more questions. But I'm going to take an educated guess that our very smart and well-informed audience has sent at least a couple of questions to you that you'd like to forward to Khaled and Daniel.
For sure. And before we launch into the Q&A session, I just wanted to thank our viewers for your continued support. We depend on your donations to cover our expenses so we can continue to bring you these important discussions. So if you are able to make a donation, please go to our website at lawacth.org and click on the donate button. We greatly appreciate your support. And without further ado, Khaled, what is your perspective on the role that Arab nations played in urging Arab Palestinians to leave the area upon the establishment of the State of Israel, as they subsequently declared war against the new State of Israel?
Well, my perspective on that is that's false. That is a sort of a trope that has lived on despite the historical record. There's no evidence that Arab states urged Palestinians to leave the country. There is plenty of evidence to show that both the Palestinian leadership at the time and Arab states actually urged Palestinians to remain. Palestinians in 1948 fled as a result of terrorism by Zionist militias, the same militias that later became part of the what is today the Israel Defense Forces, the Irgun, the Stern Gang. Folks like Yitzhak Shamir and Menachem Begin headed these terrorist groups. They were wanted by the British for committing heinous acts of terrorism that included the assassination of the UN mediator and attacks on British personnel as well as Arab civilians in Palestine. So it was through mass terrorism that the majority of the Palestinian population, of the Arab population of Palestine, fled, with the expectation that they would return. Of course, here we are 70 some odd years later. Israel has never allowed them to return.
Thank you. For Daniel, the RAND report is fascinating. Thank you. Were there any questions and or discussions about the possibilities for peace and what might be done to ensure peace in the future?
Yeah, it is. I mean, in some sense, that was the entire premise of the study. The study was, is there a feasible alternative that would lead to peace? And I think the summation is that without trust building, without international support, and without building trust between the Israelis and the Palestinians, rebuilding the trust that I think existed in the early 90s but is now gone, that there is no prospect for peace, at least the kind of peace that the international community envisions at this point.
Thank you so much. I guess for either of you, Khaled mentioned that the U.S. has been giving Palestinians sticks rather than carrots. What kind of carrots would the Palestinians want and accept?
I mean, at this stage, the role that the United States has played, we're not even talking about sticks, we're not even really talking about carrots, because things like international aid have already been cut. It is against the law. It is the law of the land, as passed by a bipartisan Congress, to provide any assistance to the Palestinian Authority. So to Dan's point earlier about, there's this conundrum about how do we deal with Gaza and make sure that aid goes through the Palestinian Authority rather than Hamas. You can't send aid through the Palestinian Authority because under U.S. law, it's prohibited. So there is, at this point, just undoing all of the sanctions that currently exist on the Palestinians would be considered, I suppose, a carrot. There is virtually no Palestinian institution, entity, or group that works with Palestinians that has not been sanctioned by the U.S. Congress. Right now we have a motion on the Senate floor to prohibit even humanitarian assistance to Gaza on an emergency basis after the massive destruction that Gaza has endured last month. There is a very strong current in the U.S. Congress and in American political the American political establishment that is very much in line with where the hard right-wing government in Israel is, and that is it's a zero-sum proposition. Any assistance to Palestinians is seen as a threat. We had people in Washington who were upset when the New York Times published, people in think tanks writing op-eds, when the New York Times published the pictures and stories of the 67 children that included 2 Israeli children, but mostly Palestinian children who were killed during the fighting in May. There were people who wrote op-eds saying that this is a horrible thing. Some people called it a blood libel. The discourse in Washington is so skewed and distorted and frankly dehumanizing of Palestinians that even humanizing dead Palestinian children is seen as an affront to the sensibilities of the pro-Israel crowd. So if we could just get to a point where we see Palestinians as equal human beings and afford, one major piece of progress would be to take some of the scrutiny that exists on every form of Palestinian assistance, which has now basically been legislated out of existence, and apply it to the far more massive package of aid that the US gives to Israel. Palestinians get a tiny, tiny fraction compared to the $3.8 billion that Israelis get, completely unscrutinized by Congress. There is no way to know if Israel is using American weaponry in accordance with US law, much less international human rights standards. So if we could start to apply some of that scrutiny and accountability on the Israeli side, a fraction of which is applied to the Palestinians, that would be a very significant carrot.
Jessica, I know we're short on time, but just to follow up on the question, because I think it was a smart one, and I think Khaled once again provides us with a very helpful perspective. First of all, Khaled, if I'm not mistaken, as it relates to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, my understanding is the Biden administration is willing to seek a waiver to allow the PA to engage there in order to accomplish the goals you talked about a little bit earlier. But going back to the questioner about what would be required to move forward, a lot of members of our audience think back to the 2000 negotiations at Camp David and the subsequent negotiations in 2008 when a Palestinian state was proposed. And I think they would benefit from understanding the reluctance from the Palestinian perspective to accept those offers. Was it security, autonomy? Were there other issues? Because what would have prevented those proposals for a Palestinian state from moving forward in the direction the questioner was asking about?
You're talking, it depends on which proposals you're talking about. There was an Israeli proposal at Camp David. There was the Clinton parameters. There was Olmert's proposal. There was Mahmoud Abbas's counter proposal to Olmert in 2008. So which proposal in particular?
Well, most, if not all of them, if I'm not mistaken, transferred 90 to 95% or more of the land in the West Bank to Palestinian control, much as when Israel gave back Gaza in 2005. So more broadly, for an American audience, given the points you're making a moment ago, what many of our audience hears and thinks is offers to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank that would provide not all, but 90+% of the relevant territory seems like, if not a perfect offer, a reasonable compromise for the type of progress we're talking about. And again, I think they'd benefit from hearing the concerns that prevented those from being markers of forward progress as opposed to just dead letters.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it depends on the proposal because they're not all similar. The Barak proposal in July of 2000 in Camp David, for example, did not approach actually the threshold that you talked about. It was not 95% of the West Bank. It was more like 85% of the West Bank with a like 100-year lease in the Jordan Valley and no capital in Jerusalem, no Palestinian sovereignty in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is very often and usually the reason that Palestinians reject Israeli proposals, because in most Israeli proposals, they don't allow for Palestinian sovereignty in Jerusalem. That was also true of the Trump plan. It was Jerusalem adjacent. Palestinians could have their capital in Abu Dis or in the north, other villages near Jerusalem, but not in the city itself. Jerusalem is the heart of the conflict. Jerusalem is the center of Palestinian national identity. It is the economic, political, cultural hub of what it means to be a Palestinian in very similar ways to what it means to be an Israeli or Jewish. That's separate from even the religious significance to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. So Jerusalem is usually where these proposals have faltered. Now, if we fast forward, so leave aside Camp David, which nobody thinks was a serious Israeli proposal. The Clinton parameters, on the other hand, were a serious proposal without a map per se, but it was text. And the fact is, Palestinians, exactly like Israelis, accepted the Clinton parameters in December of 2000 with reservations, almost identical language to the Israeli conditional acceptance of the Clinton parameters. And they accepted it as a basis to continue negotiations. The reality is Clinton left office, there was a violent uprising going on, and Barak was not reelected. He was replaced by Ariel Sharon. So the Clinton parameters became a dead letter for reasons other than, the Palestinian rejection. Fast forward to the Annapolis talks. Ehud Olmert's proposal was significant on the substance and even allowed for Palestinian sovereignty in key parts of Jerusalem and had very interesting provisions for the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Temple Mount area that would be based on an international consortium that would rule over there. It was very forward-looking, groundbreaking in a lot of ways for an Israeli, but the political dynamics surrounding those negotiations were doomed the process from the beginning. Olmert was facing indictment. He was a lame duck. He was on his way out. He was going to be replaced, even within his own party, by Tzipi Livni. And Mahmoud Abbas, literally 2 months earlier, had lost the civil war, and a year before that had lost an election. So he was weakened. He was far too weak to accept any kind of proposal. So when we look at any proposal, you have to look at not just the substance that exists on the paper, you have to look at the political and the power dynamics of the situation outside the negotiating room, because that is what very often determines the success or failure of those negotiations.
So one quick comment on carrots, because I think it's a great question. What can the U.S. offer that is new? The political negotiations will be the political negotiations, and I think Khaled has captured that well. The one other thing that we have, RAND has shown and others have shown as well, is if you can offer a pathway towards, Palestinian economic vibrance, if you can help build a successful Palestinian state. This was one of RAND's reports from many years ago, building a successful Palestinian state, where we lay out a pathway for doing that. And others have done it as well. Part of this is building infrastructure that connects the Palestinian territories. I mean, right now you have, a people that split across Gaza and the West Bank. You need a physical infrastructure to connect them to create the opportunities. And we have not, I don't think there's been that many serious proposals to do that. I mean, there's a lot of focus on humanitarian assistance, but if you could, humanitarian assistance plus infrastructure investment plus private sector, so both autonomy, political autonomy, but also an opportunity for economic livelihoods, which I think is often put to the side. It's often, let's figure out the politics and we'll figure out the economics later. Because even with a two-state solution, very limited autonomy, they still don't get control over their borders. It's a major problem.
Thank you. Is there any willingness of the Gulf states to furnish economic aid for the betterment of life among the Palestinians?
Khaled, I could answer that briefly. I think the short answer is yes. And Khaled, you can disagree if you want. And I'll bring up something that's, it's a little bit controversial, particularly in recent months, is the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, part of that was an explicit intent from the Gulf states to invest in the Palestinians and to invest in Israeli Arabs. And so a lot of the early partnerships that the UAE engaged with was partnerships with Israeli Arab businessmen and opportunities to invest in the Palestinian territories, particularly the West Bank, high tech and otherwise. Where that will go, what the current situation, the conflict we saw, the change in government will mean for that, I don't know. But I do think that there still is a intent among politicians and also the private sector in the Gulf to invest.
Thank you. And this next, okay.
No, go ahead.
This next question is for Khaled. What will it take to achieve the resolution that you state to be necessary between Ramallah and Gaza?
Well, I mean, it may take actually an entirely new leadership in Ramallah because at this point, President Abbas himself seems to be the biggest obstacle to internal Palestinian reform and reconciliation. And before this latest crisis, he had canceled scheduled elections at the very last moment. So there is really considerable frustration among Palestinians with the leadership on so many levels. Their impotence during the Gaza crisis, their impotence in the situation in Jerusalem, the fact that they're increasingly seen as corrupt and authoritarian and canceling elections. So I mean, it might just need a new leadership on the Palestinian side, but other than that, what it sort of big picture, what it needs is a remaking of the Palestinian national movement from the ground up, because the institutions of the movement, like the PLO, have completely decayed. I mean, the PLO, which is supposed to be the umbrella organization that represents all Palestinians, really doesn't really exist except as a letterhead and business cards at the UN and in Western capitals. So to rebuild the Palestinian national movement, which is now in its weakest state, one of the things that we saw during the crisis in May was this new dynamic among Palestinians, not just in occupied territories, but including those in Israel. There was a sense that, in many ways, Palestinians in Israel were leading the uprising. They're calling it the Unity Intifada. Even now, they're referring to it. Not at an official level. Officially, the Palestinian Authority looks down on this kind of grassroots mobilization because it's a threat to them. But at a grassroots level, this pan-Palestinian dynamic that has emerged, that has brought together West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, and even Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, has sort of breathed new life into the Palestinian national movement. And there are those who want to reinvent it all on those lines, and sort of, forget about two states, forget about Oslo is dead, all of that. No, none of that's going to happen. Palestinians are have the same struggle regardless of their legal status, in these 4 or 5 different created groups. And so that might be the future of the Palestinian national movement. But at a minimum, what needs to happen is to reform the PLO and make it a truly representative institution that includes all factions and all constituencies of Palestinians, including the refugees outside of Palestine and including groups like Hamas.
Perfect. This will probably be my final question to both of you. With the new government in Israel, will it be possible to restart negotiations with the Palestinians?
I'll take a first stab at that because it's, I think, pretty straightforward. The short answer is no. There will not be negotiations with this new government. The prime minister is an opponent of the very idea of 2 states. He's called it, Bennett has called it national suicide for Israel to imagine the possibility of an independent Palestinian state in what he considers the land of Israel. And he favors annexation of the majority of the West Bank territory. Negotiations are precisely the sort of thing that are so drastic that they would immediately cause this coalition to collapse. So there will not be negotiations.
Yeah, I certainly echo that. Though the one change we might see, and this is a point Khaled raised earlier, which was the condition of Israeli Arabs within Israel itself, definitely treated as 2nd or 3rd class citizens. One thing we might see, is a change in some of the law, the architecture surrounding that, their status right now. So I don't see any hope really for a 2-state solution on the table in the near future. Conditions might improve within Israel itself, but that will do little for the Palestinians.
Wonderful. Well, Daniel and Khaled, thank you so much for our audience. A lot of them were asking about where they can continue to see this talk or share it afterwards. You'll get an email tomorrow as a follow-up, which will include a link to the YouTube discussion, and will also include Daniel's email in that follow-up email to all of you. So make sure to check that email when it comes to you. I can say email one more time. Anyway, thank you so much, gentlemen. Dan, I'll turn this back over to you. Jessica,
thank you very much. And Khaled, Daniel, thank both of you so much for an absolutely fascinating conversation. I tend to joke about these things and say that I always wish these programs could go longer, but I'm heartfelt on that today. There were so many interesting and important and critical points that you both brought up that I'd love to dig into deeper if time allotted, and I hope you'd both be willing to join us again in the future. I think as we conclude the second part of this 2-part series, we have a sense of the scope of the challenge ahead of us. Very, very strong feelings on both sides of this conflict. And Daniel made a point that I'm going to take away from this in particular, that perhaps the best place to look for solutions is from the ground up, in finding ways internationally to foster a regeneration of those person-to-person relationships that once existed but sadly no longer do. And perhaps the lesson to be learned is, in the Middle East, just like in the US, sometimes politics is too important to be left to the politicians. But Khaled, Daniel, thank you both so much. Kim, I'm going to ask you to join us again and give our audience a proper thanks, because as always, these programs only succeed because of their involvement and their attention and their participation.
This was such an important and critical discussion. I am so appreciative of your time and expertise, all of you. We learned so much, and this is a continuing discussion. So as Dan said, we need to have you back to guide us through this very challenging situation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.